Alright, so today I will be talking about imperialism in America from the period of 1880 to 1910. And we'll begin shortly. So American imperialism, as defined, is the expansion in power. American imperialism is a term that refers to the economic, military, and cultural influence of the United States on other countries. So America's expansion, while it had made various acquisitions of land before 1880 to the 1910 period that we'll be speaking about, they acquired, other lands, like the Louisiana Purchase was, before 1880. They had made multiple territories before 1880, but we'll be discussing the territories that they established or, added to the Union or purchased and acquired during this time period. So this is the land that they acquired during the Reconstruction and Western Statehood period. And the first one they acquired during this period was the Western Triangle Island in 1880, then the Falklands Islands, 1884. They have the Dakota Territory, the Montana Territory, and the Washington Territory, all in 1889. And while these were territories they had already, they were never established as part of the Union up until 1889. And then you have the Oklahoma Territory, the Idaho, and Wyoming Territory in the 1890. And the last one during this period was the Cherokee Outlet in 1893. And now this is the land that they acquired during the Pacific and Caribbean expansion. They acquired the Republic of Hawaii in 1898, Wake Island in 1899, Guam, Puerto Rico in 1899 as well, and the Samoan Islands in 1900. Now it's important to note that the first period that we spoke about, they acquired the land. The Reconstruction period was from 1866 to 1897, so we'll only be talking about the last 17 years of it. And Pacific and Caribbean expansion was from 1898 to 1945, and again we'll be talking from 1898 to 1910s. So the first acquisition they made was the Western Triangle Island. Western Triangle Island was previously claimed by Mexico and then was claimed by the United States under the Guano Islands Act. So the Guano Islands Act basically permitted the United States to lay claim to any islands that were unclaimed at the time, and they also had to have guano deposits. So guano deposits are basically a factor used to make gunpowder. So at the time, with war going on and the evolution of weapons, guano was something that people sought after. And it also claimed that the United States could have the territories until the guano deposits were finished. After that, they would have to relinquish the territories. The next acquisition they made were the Alacrans Islands, and Alacrans Islands were also previously claimed by Mexico, and again under the Guano Islands Act, the United States claimed it in June of 1884. Next is the Dakota Territory, and the Dakota Territory was acquired in 1861, but it wasn't until 1889 where the United States actually admitted it into the Union, and they split the Dakota Territory into North and South Dakota. And again, like I said, this island was acquired, this land was acquired during the Louisiana Purchase, but it wasn't admitted to the Union until 1889. The Montana Territory was admitted as the 41st state in 1889, and it existed from 1864 until 1889 when it was admitted as the 41st state in the Union. And prior to this, it was part of the Idaho Territory. Again, prior to separating these territories or making them states, the United States had, large space of land that they, named as one territory. The Washington Territory was the 42nd state of Washington, and this territory existed from March 2nd, 1853 until November 1889, when the territory was admitted into the Union as the state of Washington. Prior to this, it was part of the Oregon Territory, similar to the territory before. This territory was acquired in 1853, but it didn't become a sovereign state of the Union, I guess, until 1889. The Oklahoma Territory was acquired in 1890, and it was organized from public land and the western half of the Indian Territory. Oklahoma Territory's history began with the Indian Intercourse Act of 1834, which is when the United States Congress set aside some land for the Native Americans, which the United States would then make this 46th state in the Union, Oklahoma. The Idaho Territory was acquired in 1890 as well, and this territory was organized, incorporated, and existed from 1863 until 1890, when again it was admitted into the Union. The Wyoming Territory was another territory, and it was acquired as part of the Louisiana Purchase, like I said before, and it was admitted into the Union as the 44th state in 1890. And the final piece of land that we'll be talking about in the Reconstruction period will be the Cherokee Outlet, which was given as a treaty, which was, I guess, acquired per a treaty with the Cherokee. The federal government purchased the Cherokee Outlet in the Indian Territory and opened it as a settlement, transferring it to Oklahoma Territory as transferred it to the Oklahoma Territory. And the lease to the Cherokee Outlet Livestock Association was then nullified by Congress in 1890, which then allowed them to acquire the land for $1.25 per acre. So this was a piece of land that they actually bought in 1890. And now we're moving on to the Pacific and Caribbean expansion. And the first piece of land acquired was the Republic of Hawaii. And the Republic of Hawaii was there, prior to the acquisition, and it was ruled by a monarch called Queen Liliuokalani. But the United States acquired this in 1893. In 1898, after there was a revolt, and it was a bloodless revolt. There was not a lot of people killed, if any killed at all. The Crown Forces basically handed over control of the government, and this was driven by the fact that there were already missionaries sent there from America, and a lot of the pineapple plantation owners had already been, talking about having a revolution so they can own this land, and it was actually described by American officials as a ripe pear ready to be plucked. And then it was annexed and joined the United States in July of 1898. Wake Island joined the Union as well in 1899, and basically the idea behind securing this piece of land was that it was a very integral part of military strategy, and it was used later on as a refueling station for the military, and it was acquired around the same time as the United States acquired Hawaii, and this was used for refueling the military, I guess, during this time. And it was also attacked by Japan before Pearl Harbor in 1941, where people of the island were able to resist the first attack, but 12 days later there was a second attack, and they weren't able to resist that, and the island was then occupied by Japan. And now we move on to perhaps the biggest acquisition at this time, and that was Guam, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines. And all three of these were acquired because of the Spanish-American War, and it led directly to the annexation of these three islands. And we made a payment of $20 million to Spain to acquire these three lands, and it was taken over by U.S. military forces at the time, so these three lands belonged to us. However, Philippines was later given its independence, or it fought for its independence and became its own country. And then Guam, the Spanish possession in the Pacific, almost all the way to the Philippines, was taken in December of 1898. The peace treaty was signed with Spain, officially turning over the United States, Guam, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines for a total amount of $20 million. And during this time, there was a heated argument about whether we should acquire the Philippines or not. But President McKinley took control of the Philippines because he deemed that it was an economic investment that we should have. And the final acquisition made during this time was the Samoan Islands, and the United States took ownership of the Samoan Islands as per the terms of the Tripartite Convention. And basically, this convention partitioned the Samoan Islands into German Samoa and the American Samoas. Eventually, America took full control of the Samoan Islands. And now just briefly discussing the expansion imperialism. Expansion overseas was not a new idea. Even before the war against Mexico, the Monroe Doctrine discussed looking, further south to see the Caribbean islands, or even beyond the Caribbean islands. And by the 1980s, there had been, much experience overseas with the military, taking control of some governments or helping some governments, take control of the situation. And as well as businessmen had ventured out there already, and they saw potential in gaining lands for trade and economic reasons. And then there was Captain A.T. Mahan of the United States Navy, which was a popular propagandist for expansion, greatly influenced by Theodore Roosevelt and other American leaders. The country with the biggest navies would inherit the earth, he said. So he had the idea that the country with the biggest ships, the biggest armies, would eventually take over most of the earth or the islands. And indeed, he was right, with America being a global power at the time, or becoming established as a global power. They were easily able to acquire many more lands than they initially had. And then the desires for expansion into the Spanish territories like Cuba led us to the Spanish-American War in 1898, which the United States gained Guam, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines, and it also occupied Cuba for several years before Cuba gained its independence once more. American Samoa was also acquired during this time, and the conclusion is that the United States went through many periods during its existence when it reached beyond its borders to acquire new lands. Some were acquired through wars, such as the Samoan War or the Spanish-American War. Others were made through purchases, like the Louisiana Purchase or Wake Island, which was claimed without war. Although some of the methods that were used in gaining this land may not have been peaceful and subjected people to war and death, America was able to acquire many territories through purchases and through laying claim to them, such as the Guano Islands Act, which allowed them to lay claim to islands that had a guano deposit on it. So there was a lot of acquisitions that we made during this time that came peacefully. And this is the Works Cited page. And now I'll show you a few videos talking about some of the acquisitions that America made during this time.
Welcome to Joe's Productions. Today we're taking a look at the rise of a world power, perhaps this groups, but something changes in the 1890s. In 1893, of course, Frederick Jackson Turner says the frontier is closed, the end of the Indian Wars with Wounded Knee in 1890. The 1890s marks a transition in U.S. history. The U.S. becomes a global power. And a couple of things to keep in mind. There's a whole bunch of motives for imperialism. One is economic. There is a desire. Remember, the Industrial Revolution is in full swing. We want to open up markets abroad, new places to trade, not just industrial goods, manufactured goods, but also agricultural ones as well. And U.S. companies want access to cheap raw materials. And you can see U.S. exports going up in each decade to follow. There's also political desires. There's a desire to compete with other nations, primarily Europe, but also Japan over in Asia. We don't want to be a second-rate nation. The countries of the world are carving up Africa and Asia, and America wants to be a world power. And so this drives us to expansion. We don't want to fall behind. Another motive is strategic or military. And that is, we want to be able to be a military force. We want to have naval bases around the world. In fact, Alfred T. Mahan, make sure you know him, he wrote a book called The Influence of Sea Power. And he basically talks about you need to have a powerful navy if you want to be a powerful country. And this is going to be a big reason why the Panama Canal is going to be a huge project that the U.S. is going to participate in. There are ideological motives. It's not just the world of business where people are talking about ideas like social Darwinism and survival of the fittest. There's this idea of the white man's burden. And people are using Charles Darwin's concepts and they're applying it to international affairs. You have the Reverend Josiah Strong who writes Our Country, and he talks about how Anglo-Saxon civilization is superior, and we as Protestant Americans need to spread our values, our civilization to the rest of the world. And these ideas are going to be used to justify colonizing other lands to spread so-called superior civilizations. You can see all these motives in the first case.
Then that's my presentation on American imperialism. Thank you.